Good afternoon. On behalf of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, welcome to today's webinar, Investigating and Prosecuting Human Trafficking. My name is Michelle Duhar-Tong, and I'm the Training and Technical Assistance Provider Network Lead for OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. You're also being joined by the National District Attorneys Association, who is working in concert with OJJDP. Today's featured presenter is Mr. Rami Badwi. Mr. Badwi is the Assistant United States Attorney for the District of the Virgin Islands and a prior faculty member with the National District Attorneys Association, National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse. Your moderator today is Allie Phillips, who is the Director with the National Center for Prosecution of Animal Abuse Consultants, National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse for the National District Attorneys Association. As your technical host, I would like to take a few minutes to discuss a few features of Adobe Connect, which will help you maximize your opportunity to participate in today's webinar. To view the bios and photos of your presenter and moderator, please access the documents which are available now in the handouts pod of the webinar dashboard. Numerous handouts will be referenced today that are also located there for your use for your resource library. To send a chat message to me, your technical host, a panelist, or another attendee, click the menu icon in the upper right corner of the chat pod, choose Start Chat With, then select Hosts, Presenters, or Specific Attendees. 2, type your message into the text box, and 3, hit Enter or click the message bubble icon to send. If you are participating in the event today as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the name of the person registered and the total number of additional people in the room with you today. I know some of you are joined by your colleagues, so again, to help us with our final count, if you're viewing alone, there's nothing you need to do at this time, but for those of you who are joining with others, please type in the name of the person registered and the total number of additional people that are joining you today. For those of you who are not familiar with OJJDP's online university, you can access additional resources and materials, toolkits, webinars, and online training by visiting the OJJDP Online University at www.ojjdpou.org. There will be several opportunities for Q&A throughout the webinar today. Please type questions as they arise in the chat window. I'd particularly like to thank those of you who are joined by a number of colleagues in your office. Remember, at the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to take a 5-minute online survey about today's presentation. We appreciate your feedback regarding this webinar. The information is used to assist in future planning and training. Now let's get started. Your moderator, again, is Ms. Allie Phillips. Allie?
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. I wanted to take an opportunity to introduce Rami Badwi. Rami is an Assistant United States Attorney for the District of the Virgin Islands and assigned to the St. Croix office. In that position, he prosecutes crimes of violence, including cases involving vulnerable victims, child exploitation, and human trafficking. He previously served as an Assistant U.S. Attorney for the districts of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. Before that, at the start of his career, he was an Assistant District Attorney in Onondaga County, New York. He prosecuted cases involving vulnerable victims, including sexual assault, domestic violence, and child sexual and physical abuse cases. He then came to the National District Attorneys Association and was a senior attorney and chief of publications for the National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse. In that position, he focused much of his work in this area of human trafficking. He even helped to develop the curriculum utilized by Girls Education and Mentoring Services, the GEMS program, to train law enforcement to investigate and prosecute cases involving sex trafficking of minors, and has authored articles on this particular topic. Rami, for years, has been such a valuable team member to NDAA and the National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse. He's a valued colleague and a valued friend. So at this time, Rami, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Allie, for that very kind introduction. And I want to also thank Michelle and OJJDP and, of course, NDAA for hosting this presentation today. For those of you who have not used NDAA's resources, it really is an incredible asset available to prosecutors out there, ADAs, AUSAs, and really all allied professionals. Not only the trainings that they put on, but the technical assistance. And that's really what I consider is their bread and butter. If you've got an issue doing research, if you want to talk about trial strategy, anything along those lines, pick up the phone, send an email, contact NDAA. It's really a great resource that I have used and continued to use and encourage you to use if you haven't done so already. I'd also like to take this moment to thank a couple people who have contributed both directly and indirectly to this presentation today. Gretchen Means, a former assistant district attorney in San Diego, California. Aaron Otis, a former prosecutor in Arizona. Shared Hope International, a great organization that does a lot of policy work and research and lobbying in the area of human trafficking. And of course, my former boss in Guam, Alicia Lim Tiaco. All of these people have contributed a great deal to the presentation that you are going to have today. Finally, I want to thank all of you for taking some time this afternoon, or for those of you on the West Coast and in Hawaii, your mornings, to join me for about 90 minutes so that we can talk about this very important topic. 90 minutes is not a lot of time to talk about human trafficking. You have seen the webinar objectives that are up there. You've got the PowerPoint in front of you. I think each of the sections that we're going to try to talk about today, you could have your own presentation, your own 90-minute presentation today. But I will do my best to give you an overview of those topics. And I know we probably have varying levels of experience here today. Perhaps there are people here who've done many human trafficking cases, sex trafficking, labor trafficking. Perhaps there are individuals who haven't done any cases at all. I'm hoping that each and every one of you will be able to take away something from this, some sort of tip, something that you can use in your everyday practice. Certainly policy is important, and certainly we'll talk a little bit about the law, but I'm really hoping that you will get practical tips that you can use in your day-to-day practice, whether you're law enforcement, whether you're a prosecutor, whether you're a civil child lawyer, whether you're a social worker, someone who works in a CAC, something that you can use in your day-to-day practice. So that's really what my goals will be here today. Okay. Allie, do we have our first poll or second poll question at this point?
Yeah, let's kick this off with a poll question. So in the chat box, would you share any tools, any website links, or names of curriculum that you have that relate to human trafficking so that we can all collect that and learn from that? So go ahead and type that into your chat box.
Thanks, Allie. I also want to encourage you today to certainly ask questions. There's going to be a way for you to type in your questions. I will try to get to those questions today, but we have little time and a lot to cover. If I can't answer your question today, I would be happy to answer it offline through NDAA at a later time, or provide you a specific resource that you're looking for. So why don't we get right into our presentation? I want to begin by talking about perception, because as people that work in this field, we need to be concerned about perception, right? What jurors are thinking, what potential jurors understand when we mention the term human trafficking. And I have this picture up here because I think a statement that this gentleman made really sort of synthesizes one of the challenges that we are going to be facing when it comes to perception. For those of you who are not old enough to remember, this is Lawrence Taylor. Lawrence Taylor was probably one of the greatest linebackers in the history of the NFL in the 1980s and early 1990s. He won a Super Bowl with the Giants back then. In 2011, and I was not involved in this case, but this is what I understand the case was about, Lawrence Taylor pled guilty to sexual misconduct, which is a misdemeanor. He has to register, but it is a misdemeanor. And he was fined $1,400, sentenced to 6 years probation. The facts of that case is LT, Lawrence Taylor, basically ordered a young woman who was being prostituted, was being trafficked, a 16-year-old girl, had that 16-year-old girl brought to his hotel room. There were indications that the 16-year-old girl had been assaulted prior to being there, and he engaged in sexual conduct with her, ultimately was charged, ultimately was arrested, pled guilty. It's my understanding he cooperated with the prosecutor, which is one of the reasons for the plea deal he received. However, instead of taking this opportunity as a teaching moment to educate people about human trafficking, LT gives an interview, and this is what he has to say about it. And this, to me, really boils down the attitude that so many people have when it comes to human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking. And that's primarily what I'm going to talk about today because that is my experience, although I think a lot of these things I talk about translate over to labor trafficking. But this is the perception that many people have. Despite the years and years of education that has been going around about human trafficking, there were so many public service announcements, agencies involving trying to educate people. This is the perception that people still have. And if you want to understand a little bit more about what your jurors are perceiving, for those of you that read newspapers, your local papers online, I'm sure many of you like to read those comments when your case gets posted or some criminal charge comes up. They're certainly entertaining. A lot of times they're absolutely ridiculous, but what is, I think, important to look at is you'll often see what your potential jurors are thinking, no matter how outrageous, but what they're thinking. And this statement by LT, as ridiculous as it sounds, is something that we need to face when trying to educate people. And it's something we should keep in mind when we are trying to investigate and ultimately prove our case at the trial level. So getting right into the law, and this is, I'm going to be using this here as an example about what we're talking about here. This is, here are your definitions of human trafficking, the federal definitions of human trafficking, and we'll talk a little bit later about your local state definitions. I understand we have people from across the country. Most states have their own human trafficking laws, and a lot of those laws mirror the Federal Trafficking Victim Protection Act. But these are the definitions we are going to be using here today. And what I'd like to point out are two things. Under the federal definition of human trafficking, it's important to realize that there is no crossing of borders required. A lot of people get human smuggling and human trafficking confused. Human smuggling does require the crossing of an international boundary. But human trafficking does not. I grew up in Syracuse, New York. You can have individuals that are trafficked without leaving Armory Square, which is the big downtown area in that city. You don't need to cross boundaries at all for that. And number two, as you'll focus on this, the real issue here, what we're focusing on is the force, the fraud, or the coercion that is used to compel a person to perform labor acts or to compel a person to perform sex acts. Those are the two important things that we need to understand when we are looking at our human trafficking investigations. Okay, breaking it down a little further, under the TVPA, these are what the elements here when we're looking at labor, or we're focusing on sex trafficking. One of the things that I want to focus on here is that under the federal law, and again, many states' statutes mirror the federal law, if you have a minor that is engaging in commercial sex act, a minor, a person under 18 who is a sex trafficking victim, you do not have to show force, fraud, or coercion. So it makes it significantly easier to prove your case. Now, if you feel comfortable and you do have that force, fraud, or coercion, you feel that you can readily prove that, then by all means charge under the force, fraud, or coercion portion of the statute because it carries a higher mandatory minimum sentence, 15 years as opposed to 10 years. Okay. Going further on, breaking down the statute even further as it relates to sex trafficking, these are the elements that are all spread out here. What I want to talk about here with interstate commerce, for those of you who are practicing in the federal system, you do have to prove that interstate commerce nexus. Don't be intimidated by that. You know, pretty much anything out there can satisfy that requirement. The use of cell phones. If the trafficker is keeping touch with the victim through a cell phone or recruiting the John through a cell phone, there's your interstate hook right there. A lot of times we're seeing victims advertised over the internet. Backpages.com, I think, still is doing it, despite requests to stop. Craigslist has stopped doing that, thankfully. The use of computers, email, even the use of condoms. If the trafficker is supplying their victims with condoms, that can be the interstate nexus hook that you need to prove your case. We have recruits, entices, or harbors. Also, the terminology is provide, obtain, transport, or maintain. So any of those things, if you're just the person that's driving the person back and forth from the trafficker's home to the John, and you know, or you should know, that a commercial sex act is going to occur, then that's enough to involve that person in your charging document. Commercial sex act, we'll talk a little bit about that more in the future, but what's important to know is the receiving of anything of value by any person in exchange for a sex act. Oftentimes our victims do not receive the money. The money goes directly from the John to the trafficker or a watcher, someone who works with the trafficker, and that is enough to prove your case. And finally, fraud, force, or coercion. We'll talk about coercion a little bit. But fraud are false promises. Is there a false promise involving wages or a false promise of legitimate work? If you come work for me, you'll work in a hotel, you'll work in on a farm or something, and you'll get paid a certain amount of money. And when you get there, and when the victim gets there, that is in fact false. So that's what we're talking about with the elements here, what you in fact need to prove. This is the definition of coercion under the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. And here's what we have, what we see here. I think, threats of harm or force, that's pretty much self-explanatory. Again, though the threats of force do not necessarily have to be directed at the victim. The harm doesn't necessarily have to be directed at the victim. It can be directed at someone else close to the victim to, again, coerce the victim into doing what she wants to do. We'll talk about some case law defining coercion in a little bit, but if one of the victims witnesses another victim being physically assaulted to get her to do a job, that is enough, that her simply watching that is enough to support the element of coercion. The abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. Telling someone that, for example, in the jurisdictions that I have practiced in, out in Guam and Saipan, we had a lot of foreign nationals who were there illegally. Telling that person, you're here illegally. If you go talk to a police officer, they're going to arrest you and put you in jail or worse. That's what we're talking about with the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. And then finally, the catch-all there, sort of any scheme, plan, or pattern, that third prong there, designed to overcome a person's will. That's sort of a very wordy, but that's actually quite easy to prove. If you have a bunch of things in that situation that you want to look at. In one of the trafficking cases that I prosecuted out in the Saipan, the trafficker really took on all of this. She would tell them, number one, they had come from China, they were here illegally. So she would say, if you talk to police, you're going to get arrested. The police will throw you in jail. She also told them that, look, the locals here are bad. If you leave this bar, if you leave where you're sleeping next door and you walk onto another local's property, they will shoot you, and they can shoot you, and no one will care about you. They'll throw your body in the sea. Again, for most people in a certain area, that's not going to be a legitimate threat. But if you're there for the first time, if you don't speak the language, if you have no understanding of your location, that is something that is, in fact, a thing that can coerce an individual into doing something. So, again, in my case, we had that whole sort of carry-all, catch-all, that sort of psychological coercion that the TVPA does allow for. And that's something that is, in fact, covered under the statute and that you can use to prove coercion. Okay. I talked about the TVPA, and I talked about the fact that it is written to include the subtle forms of coercion that do go on. It's not always force. It's not always threats of force. There's not always physical restraint. Telling someone over and over again that they are useless, that this is all they can do, what are they going to do if they leave, threatening them with arrest by the police, or the fact that the locals are violent people will kill them. This sort of psychological coercion is, in fact, covered by the TVPA, and it's one of the benefits of prosecuting under the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. It's one of the benefits of this versus the old Mann Act cases that we used to see during the early parts before the TVPA was enacted. So that is that's something to keep in mind. Subtle forms of coercion. Just because you don't have that overt threat of force against the person or somebody else doesn't mean you do not have a trafficking case. Okay. I've cited these cases here, and I just want to talk briefly because each of these cases, I think, illustrate what we're talking about legally when we're discussing coercion and what you need to prove when you're bringing a case. The Kosminski case up top there, a Supreme Court case from 1988, this is one of the reasons that the TVPA is actually enacted, and one of the reasons that the TVPA includes the specific language it does. In this case, this was an old labor, under the old labor trafficking statute. What you had were two cognitively impaired individuals. I think they had an IQ of 67 and 70. They were working on a dairy farm in Michigan. They were living in squalid conditions. They were isolated, working up to 17 hours a day for $15 a week, and then they weren't being paid at all. In addition to the physical beatings that they suffered and the threats of beatings that they suffered, the government's theory was there was also this psychological coercion, which included isolation, the substandard living conditions, the verbal abuse that effectively brainwashed the victims into believing that they had no choice but to work on this farm for the descendant for little or no wages. The Supreme Court came back with a decision and specifically said, look, psychological coercion is not included in this statute. When the TVPA was drafted, as I said, they include language in history that includes subtle forms of coercion, including this psychological coercion. And oftentimes, Kosminski is cited as a reason for the TVPA, which is why I bring that up there today. U.S. versus Todd. This, again, talks about force, the use of force and threats of force. And Todd's an important case because in that case, you had victims that at one point had an opportunity to escape, but in fact came back. In this situation, you had an 18-year-old girl that was being trafficked by her boyfriend, advertised on Craigslist. She was made to walk the tract. The defendant used everything to coerce her: physical beatings, verbal abuse, making her feel like nothing. He controlled her money, would give her, I think, $35 a day for food and cleaning supplies. She felt that she had nowhere else to go. And in fact, in this case, the defendant also, my understanding was, assaulted another one of the victims in front of the victim, and that scared the victim enough into engaging in commercial sex act. What the court said was, in addition to all the physical assaults, the fact that she was reduced to effectively a state of dependence proved the coercion. So Todd's an important case for that, and includes the psychological coercion as well as the physical coercion and force that we're talking about. And then finally, Bradley. The important thing to know about Bradley is that the opportunity to escape is not dispositive. The fact that individuals are not physically restrained is not dispositive. This was a labor trafficking case where 3 Jamaicans were recruited to work at a tree removal company in New Hampshire. Once they get to New Hampshire, their passports are taken, their travel documents are taken. They don't know anyone in the area. They're isolated. No place really where they can go out on this tree farm. And what the court held there is that these special vulnerabilities that these particular victims had can be taken into account when you're trying to determine whether or not the actions taken by the traffickers in fact amount to coercion. So again, just an illustration. I understand that your local jurisdiction law may be different, but if you are assessing a case, these sort of cases help you sort of understand what we're talking about when we're talking about the whole continuum of coercion that is used and that is illegal under the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, and in some cases your state trafficking under your state trafficking statutes. I've mentioned your state trafficking statutes. If you're not sure whether your state has a statute, or you want to know what your state statute looks like, or you want to know how it compares to other states. If you're a policy person out there and you want to make some changes, the National District Attorneys Association, NCPCA, has a compilation of state statutes. Go to their website, look at publications. It's pretty easy, and then it goes down alphabetically by state. And again, if you do have questions, contact NDAA. They can point you in the right direction, but it's a great resource to have. All right, the next topic that we're going to talk about here, or the next portion of the presentation, is identifying victims. How are you going to investigate and prosecute a case if you can't identify victims? And this is an area, unfortunately, where I think everyone is having difficulties, every law enforcement agency, because they don't necessarily present, it's not obvious at first if someone is a trafficking victim or not. There are a lot of challenges out there to interviewing the victims. Oftentimes, victims have fear of law enforcement, so they're not going to answer questions truthfully. They may have allegiances to their trafficker. They may be scared that they're going to get deported or removed from the United States. Or simply they may be viewed as law enforcement as, simply you're prostituting. That's against the law, so I'm going to arrest you, and I'm not going to look further than that. So, identifying victims is one of the challenges, and we're going to talk about how to sort of identify and assess whether or not someone is a victim of human trafficking. These are your typical areas where you're going to see human trafficking cases: your street prostitution, escort services, and then your more commercial areas, massage parlors and bars. All of these areas are where you're going to find trafficking victims. I'm sure if you talk to your law enforcement agents out there, they can point to areas where, you know, homeless youths are living on the streets, shelters that they go to, places where prostitution is going on, commercial establishments that are concerns for them. In those areas, you are more than likely going to find human trafficking cases, sex trafficking or labor cases. You have in your handouts a comprehensive human trafficking assessment. I provided both Health and Human Services documents as well as the one from the Polaris Project. Really good handouts, a good place to start if you're looking for questions and sort of an assessment plan to put in place to try and find these trafficking victims. Okay. We're going to talk about coercion questions here. If you are a first responder, someone who, you know, either again working, whether you're working in a domestic violence shelter, whether you're working in a homeless shelter, whether you're working in a local clinic that's treating someone, you need to have some sort of human trafficking assessment situation or plan set up to try and determine, is this person a victim or not? These are some types of questions that you can ask here. You know, do you, and we've talked a lot about that. You know, what were your expectations? What would happen to you if you didn't want to do something? Did anyone take your legal papers ever? Did anyone threaten you? Did anyone make you feel like something bad was going to happen to you? There are a lot of, again, these questions aren't rocket science, but depending on the type of victim that you have or what the situation is, these are some questions that you can ask to try to determine. Basically, is this person under some sort of control? Is this person under someone else's control? Someone watching them? Something that someone that is making them do something that they don't want to do, and feeling uncomfortable about doing something is the start of a conversation that you're going to have with the person. Money questions, okay? The big thing is, who is controlling your money? If someone else, if another person is controlling that person's money, then that's a good indicator that that individual may be trafficked. Does someone hold on to their money? Does someone how do you pay for things? Does someone give you an allowance, so to speak? Does someone pay for your food or give you money so you can buy food? Are you in debt? Do you owe money for certain things? And who do you owe money to, and what do you owe money for? In one of the trafficking cases that I prosecuted, the victims were required to make a certain amount of money every week, and a vast majority of that money went to, quote unquote, their housing. I mean, they lived in a little room, three of them lived in a tiny room which was attached to a bar, and they were required to pay an exorbitant amount of rent for that, pay for their food, pay for all their, food when they got it, pay for all of their clothing, pay for their cleaning supplies, and they could never get out of that debt. So again, the control and access to money is a good indicator that you may have a victim of human trafficking. Fraud questions, we talked a little bit about this before, but when the person came, these are more so in your labor trafficking cases, but also in your sex trafficking cases, what were your expectations? If you were recruited, did someone tell you about a job? Was it a legitimate job? What was that legitimate job? How much money were you promised a week to work at that legitimate job? And were your expectations met? And if they were not met, why were they not met? Again, in one of the cases that I prosecuted, you had 3 women from China that were recruited to come to Saipan, and they were promised that they could work legitimate jobs. They could either work at a hotel, they could work as a housekeeper, or they could work on a farm, or they could work in a restaurant as a waitress, and they would make $1,000 a month, which was huge money for these 3 women that came from a very poor province in China. That's what their expectations were. when they arrived, they found out very quickly that none of that was true. They were going to be in a bar, working, selling drinks to men, and having sex with men for money. Again, not at all what their expectations were, but that fraud, identifying that fraud is a good way to determine whether or not you have a trafficking victim here. And then finally, your force questions. Again, these are pretty obvious. There are some questions up there. Again, were you ever physically abused? Were you ever sexually abused? Did you drug use? Oftentimes we see our traffickers are going to hook someone on drugs. One of the cases I had involved 3 14-year-old girls, and the trafficker allowed the girls to live with her. She was a woman, and she was the first person to provide methamphetamine to these girls and got them hooked on methamphetamine. And that is how she would control them and coerce them and got them to engage in sex acts. It was for the money for meth. Again, these are all good questions. Again, none of these questions are dispositive, and they're not the catch-all. They're not going to reveal that smoking gun, but enough yes answers to a variety of these questions, again, should allow you to assess and identify whether you have a victim of trafficking or whether you have a victim of something else. Okay. All right. I'll sort of finish up one more section, then I'll see if we can take some time to take some questions, if that's okay. I have this picture up here under the identifying victims of human trafficking because this was, I think it's important for, if you want to develop an assessment plan, if you want to develop a way of identifying victims in your jurisdiction, it's important to develop relationships with your non-governmental agencies, your nonprofits, your shelters, whether it's your homeless shelters, your domestic violence shelters. Many of us aren't fortunate enough to have a sex trafficking shelter. Guma Esperanza here was a women's shelter that we had on Saipan. Great agency. We were able to go to them when we had a concern. They would do the intake on a particular victim. It's a very nice, warm place for victims to go. It's a lot better than a police station or a U.S. Attorney's office. The women there are trained to ask questions in a very comfortable way, tone of voice, everything. It was a great organization to have to help us identify victims. And then beyond that, to provide services to victims. Guma Esperanza was a great place. They had grants to get these victims medical treatment. They even had the ability to help them apply for T visas to get them status in the country from our individuals who were here illegally, who are victims of trafficking. We'll talk about the T visa later on, but it's important in your whole assessment plan to develop relationships with places like Guma and Esperanza. Collaboration. That's the key to prosecuting these cases, collaboration. Okay. At this point, maybe we have some time for questions.
Yes,
out there?
I do. I have 2 questions for you. But first, I wanted to thank everyone for sharing all the great resources that you did in the chat. And just to remind you that this event will be archived in 2 weeks, so you can actually go back and listen again and share this with your colleagues. So, Rami, the first question that came in is asking, how can human trafficking be prosecuted if certain types of massage therapy, such as rolfing or Reiki, does not require certification and the victims may be from China and they don't speak English?
That's a great question, and I guess you're sort of wondering, how do we get into, if we have these sort of commercial businesses in our jurisdictions, how do we get into these businesses and get one of these individuals to speak to us? We of course have the language problems. In one of the cases that I prosecuted in Saipan, that's exactly what we had. Not in a massage parlor, but we had 3 women who were working ostensibly in a bar. but they were being coerced to engage in commercial sex act for the owner or mama-san of this particular bar. The women were not allowed access to people who spoke Chinese. They were the mama-san was the one who would take their money, and the mama-san was saying, look, if you leave this building, you're going to, one of the locals will do something horrible to you, and all the sort of coercion to make them, although they were not physically restrained, keep them in there. So I guess 2 tips for that. Number one, in our case, ultimately one of the women was able to talk to a health inspection worker who happened to speak Chinese and who alerted our federal ombudsman there, who then talked to our human trafficking shelter, and we were able to get communication with her that way. The other thing, I guess the other attempt would be is surveillance. If you've got an area where if you have, let me back up. If you have a commercial business that you think is engaging in some sort of trafficking, labor trafficking, human trafficking, if you can send someone in there to surveil the, watch the place from the outside and then surveil the place inside to try to get contact with these individuals. It's very hard. At times they'll maybe be able to get a message to a customer who is there who can get out and talk to law enforcement. But that's a very, very tough question. I think everyone's dealing with that. Again, all I can say is, if you make your local law enforcement aware of the problem, if you make the people that are going to come in contact with these type of people aware of the problems, to know what to look for, training in that situation, then they'll hopefully be able to report if something is going on, report to you so that you can get in there and try to get more information, hopefully lead to a successful prosecution of one of these cases.
The next question is asking if there are any cases in which an organization has been charged with human trafficking related crimes. For instance, using the Chapter 8 guidelines to fine an organization that uses debt bondage, or has all prosecutions simply been aimed at individuals?
That's a really good question, and honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if if a company has ever been, if you've got a big company that is engaging in labor trafficking practices, if they've ever been prosecuted for that. I'd be happy to talk to you at a later date when I can do some research for you, but I don't know off the top of my head. Maybe one of our other presenters or one of the attendees here might be able to help us out and provide us that information. Good question, though.
We've had a couple of more questions come in. Let me see if we can squeeze in 1 or 2 more before you continue. So the question is whether you can provide a little more information about the phrase anything of value that you were talking about. Is it anything of monetary value, such as cash, goods, a place to stay? What about things like increased credibility or status in a gang, if you provide that for a girl? Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, what I will say about this is, in my understanding in the law that I've seen out there, when we're talking anything of value, it's anything of monetary value. You're not only, it's housing, it's not only cash, but housing, food, something along those lines. I think we're talking about, and that's a very good question, reputation in a gang. I know that part of what's considered coercion is if the trafficker would take steps to harm a person's reputation. And in fact, if they're, perhaps it's not necessarily anything of in that sense, it's not anything of monetary value, but it perhaps might fall under coercion. The fact that if you don't do what they're asking you to do, you're going to be less in the eyes of the gang member or the leader of the gang or in the gang family, and perhaps that is something that can fall under coercion. But as far as commercial, as far as value, my understanding is it has to have some sort of commercial value. That's all the case law I've seen out there. Good question, though.
All right, let's try to squeeze in just one more. And it's a question about, are the identifiers different for Native women in Indian country who've been trafficked?
Native women in Indian countries who have been trafficked. That's a very good question, and I don't know if I necessarily can answer that. Certainly, I think, having worked with a variety of groups, very diverse group of victims, I think that everything is going to be a lot of, you certainly need to be culturally sensitive as to what's going on with the victim and their community and where they're from. But as far as if the identifiers are different, I guess in the sense that perhaps something that, and again answering this, I'll answer this generally because I haven't prosecuted one of those types of cases. But again, if there is something that would affect an individual's reputation in that particular community that might not have an impact on someone's reputation in another community, that is something, if you're asking questions and they talk about, well, if I didn't do this, this was what was going to be told to the people in my community, and that's something that I really didn't like. If you're asking questions along the lines of coercion and that comes up, that is something. That is, I guess, an identifier that would be different from perhaps another community. I probably didn't answer your question very well, but that's something that I can think of off the top of my head right now.
All right, I'll save the rest of the questions when you're ready for another question break.
Okay, thanks, Sally. Okay, just finally on the issue of identifying victims here, and the idea of collaborating with our local nonprofits, and one of the programs that's set up right now is a program out of an Oakland, California-based medical clinic, Asian Health Services, Banti Sarai. They provide medical care. A lot of the medical care they provide are to low-income individuals or homeless youths. And they have developed a CSEC protocol, or commercial sexual exploitation of children protocol. And what they will do when they're treating patients, minors between 11 and 18, if a minor answers yes to 2 or more of the following, when they come in, they're taking their medical history. What's the health problem? What's wrong with you? All right, I'm going to ask you a series of questions as part of that medical health history. If they answer yes to 2 or more, and if they want, if the person who's being treated, the youth is being treated, if they want to, a program coordinator at Banti Sarai will contact that minor within 72 hours to offer them, as a beginning step, some other services, and with the idea of hopefully eventually coaxing them into, speaking to someone in law enforcement. They will also make a local referral to local child protective services. Again, if you're thinking outside the box, trying to identify victims, work with your the nonprofit entities that you have. Individuals who are trafficked, who engage in commercial sex acts, who are prostituted, are going to have a variety of health issues. So we want to not only work with our local shelters and nonprofit providers, but also let's not forget our local area health clinics. Okay. All right, we're going to move now to the investigative interview. So you've done your assessment at this point. You think you may have a victim of potential victim of human trafficking. What's important to know is that your victim of human trafficking will probably have a lot of blocks, a lot of safety concerns. I've listed those right up there, things that you need to take into account. Before you are going to get any information out of these individuals, you have to allay these fears, okay? If you have a homeless youth, where is that homeless youth, going to stay? If they're afraid of retaliation against, their daughter or a family member or even a friend, what are you going to do about that? Oftentimes our victims of trafficking consider their traffickers their boyfriends or their girlfriends. In many situations, they are the only people who've ever provided who've ever shown any interest in these individuals and their quote-unquote well-being, or shown them what they feel is any type of love or attention. How are you going to address those issues before you get any sort of information out of them? That's going to help you a long way. It's going to go a long way to whether you get information from there or not, whether they're willing to talk to you or not, addressing their safety concerns. And we talked about, knowing your local NGOs and your victim service providers. Okay, if housing and how the people are going to eat is a concern, do you have a relationship with a local shelter that can at least take the victim in temporarily, someplace where you can go to talk about that? If they're here illegally and they're afraid of being removed from this country, there is now, under the TVPA, a trafficking visa, a T visa that can in fact be applied for. Now the application has to, the initial application has to come from federal law enforcement, your Homeland Security investigations, or your Immigration Customs Enforcement officer. What you can have your local case agent initially do, contact HSI, contact ICE, get that person temporary status so that any removal proceedings are stayed, so they're not going to be removed immediately, and also get them to provide them the opportunity to work temporarily and access services. They can do that before applying for the T visa. The T visa can take some time, can take several months to get, if not close to a year. But you want to begin that process right there. That will go a long way to help alleviate their fears. Okay, I know you're concerned, but this is what we can try. You're concerned about being removed. This is what we can do. Important to know about one of the requirements for the T visa is that your trafficking victim has to comply with reasonable requests for assistance in a criminal investigation or prosecution. And you need, it goes a long way, although you're not required to have it. You need something from a law enforcement officer, a certification that says, in fact, they've done that. If you get that, the T visa application is going to be processed a lot faster. And when they get the T visa, there is a path to citizenship for that. It also would allow them to bring in a family member or husband or wife in certain circumstances as well. So the T visa is really a good thing out there. And again, it's something you want to have in your arsenal when you're trying to get the victim to talk to you. Of course, you're going to want to assess for any threats to the potential victim and gather as much information as possible, what's going on in this person's world, before you turn the person over to an interviewer who's actually going to ask them specific questions about their victimization. Okay. Again, what's going to happen to them? That's a big question. If you have the relationships with the NGO, your shelter, someplace to send these individuals, someplace to provide housing for these individuals, that's going to help them. Some of them aren't going to want to go home. You might have a runaway who doesn't want to go home because at home they've been victims of physical or sexual abuse. So again, being able to address and alleviate their fears and have someplace to send them is going to go a long way to helping you get information from them in the future. And then when you're interviewing them, I like to say that, initially the things you're going to want to focus on, and a lot of this is very, is pretty obvious and pretty clear, but their vulnerabilities. Okay, a jury is going to want to know how they found themselves in the situation, how they, why were they vulnerable to being recruited or enticed by a trafficker. And that's, initially when you're starting the interview, I think a lot of victims, in my experience, I found that's what they're really, willing to talk about first. their background. Why did they run away? Did they come from a broken home? Were they abused physically or sexually? Were they hooked on on some sort of drug? Getting those vulnerabilities out is important to eventually demonstrating later on this is why this individual, again, not blaming the individual, but why this individual was susceptible to falling into the arms of this trafficker. Logistics, I think in that initial part you're going to also want to talk logistics because that's where you're going to find corroboration. That's what you're going to want to start looking for immediately. What was the form of communication? Was it a cell phone? Was it an email? How were they transported? Where did they go? Were they driven around by someone? Who drove that person? Was there any kind of advertising? Any